Sorry about that. I'm a little late. I didn't know you guys started so early down here. Oh boy, makes me nervous. I'm not used to preaching before. And we good? Oh, that sounds better. And I wanted a few announcements I wanted to make as far as the youth group go. I guess I'll use this opportunity for parents and such. We do have the Harvest Fest coming up here September 25th, and it's a long day. It's a great day. If you have never sent your teen to Harvest Fest and you have a new teen in the youth group, I like to think of it as a kind of like a day of camp. But there's a lot that goes on. There's 3 times of preaching and a lot of different things to be involved with. Only an hour away from here in Montrose, I believe that's where it's at. And so it's a great time. We go every year. But I do want to let you know as well that the deadline for that's coming up very quickly. I've had the sign-up sheet out in the teen room for a little bit, but I figured I'd let the parents know as well about that. The deadline will be basically a week from Wednesday today that we need to know if your teen wants to go, and then we'll send in the registration and all that. It's $20. I always say if that $20 is an issue, then we'll make something work, so there's no problem there. But it is an enjoyable time. I enjoy it. I do think the teens will as well. And so a lot of things going on this fall, and we're glad to get things going. I'd like to call normalcy. In the summertime can be quite busy when it comes to the teens being involved in different things like camp and missions trips. And so I always look forward to getting back into the normal routine of things for the fall months. And with that is Harvest Fest, and it's a good time. If you have any questions about that, please let me know. 2 Corinthians chapter 8 will be there, and I hope you found that. We'll be jumping around a few different passages tonight, and I hope it's an encouragement and maybe even a challenge in many different ways you tonight. The title is The Grace of Giving, The Grace of Giving. And, Pastor, he's gone, so I get to come in and talk about giving. Yeah, he paid me to do it. No, I'm joking. He didn't. But we're actually going to take a different approach to this a little bit, and not so much about the financial side, although that is part of giving, but we'll be talking about different ways, I guess, that you can give, but also just how you give. And that's mainly what I want to focus on tonight. 2 Corinthians chapter 8, first of all, I'll go ahead and read verses 1 through 5. It says, "Moreover, brethren, we do you to wit of the grace of God bestowed on the churches of Macedonia, how that in a great trial of affliction, the abundance of their joy and their deep poverty abounded unto the riches of their liberality. For to their power I bear record, yea, and beyond their power they were willing of themselves, praying us with much entreaty that we would receive the gift and take upon us the fellowship of the ministering to the saints. And this they did, not as we hoped, but first gave their own selves to the Lord, and unto us by the will of God." Just last week, I was encouraging the teenagers on this passage here. Last week, it was the last youth group for our seniors, I guess you can say our graduates. And last Wednesday that they were going to be in the youth group, and I always try to think of something that would be applicable for them as they move on. And actually some of the graduates had already moved on before that, but we did still have a few down there last Wednesday. And so I always think about and pray about, what would the Lord have me to talk about to these teenagers that are going to be moving on to bigger things, I guess, and whatever direction they may be taking, something that I could give them. And really wasn't too long after I started praying, the Lord led me to this passage of 2 Corinthians, and I started digging into it a little bit, and I was kind of like, God, why something about giving? I was a little bit confused there. But as I started digging a little bit deeper, I did find that this was something that was actually, I thought, was very applicable to these teenagers and really the whole group. And just not in what you give, but how you give. And I started studying a bit more, and I believe that it was just an excellent going away message for this group. I started thinking about the teenagers and just how much they have spent in the youth group. Typical teenager will spend 6 years in a youth group, and that's a long time, 7th through 12th grade. And do the math, it's about 52 weeks, if you remember that from schooling in a year. And once you cut out some of the special Wednesdays, missions conference, and all that, I'd estimate that a teenager is in youth group for maybe about 290 or so Wednesdays, 290 preaching opportunities that I would get or a different youth pastor would get. And it's really such an honor to be able to invest in just that amount of time into a teenager's life. I started thinking of not just youth group, but how many services have many of the teenagers in our youth group spent in this church from, say, kindergarten on up, Sundays, Sunday schools, and just a lot of investment that people have poured in to these teenagers' lives. And you can't forget about the parents as well. The parents have invested a lot and invested countless hours, more than what I have ever done, more than what a Sunday school teacher has ever done. Countless of hours and time poured into a teenager's life up to the point where, okay, now they're ning on. And it's not to say that, you still don't have the opportunities to invest, but just kind of a different thing. You just don't have that time anymore. And, by that point, you just start thinking of the investment that you've poured into them. And I'm not saying it's like, boy, I've poured so much into these teenagers' lives. That's not what I'm saying whatsoever. It is such a pleasure to be used of God in this way, and I'm sure a Sunday school teacher thinks the same thing, and a parent probably thinks the same way. It's a pleasure, it's a blessing to be used of God, to be a tool in God's hands, to be able to invest time and just God's Word into somebody's life. But ultimately, we understand that God gives the increase for these things. You have to understand that. When you are in that position, that God gives the increase. He's the one that ultimately is going to lead that teenager in the path that he desires, and we're just tools in his hand, and what a special gift that is. But my point was to them that night was that so much has been given to them spiritually, invested in their lives. And I just used youth group as an example, but so much has been invested in this church, into these teenagers' lives by the hand of God, through investment of other people. And my encouragement to them was, let that be a motivation for you to give back what God has given to you. That makes sense? And so that's why we call that grace giving. Grace giving it's different than just encouraging somebody to put money in the offering plate. It's actually allowing somebody to realize you're taking the approach where it's like, I want to show you what God has done for you, the grace that He has bestowed upon your life, and let that be the motivation for how you live your life in giving, whether that is of money, whether that is of talents or time or whatever it may be. That's what grace giving is. And that is exactly what I'd like to talk about here tonight. Back in our text, we already read that, but Paul is meeting with the church of Corinth. 2 Corinthians would tell us that. And he's making his rounds. This would be his third missionary journey. He's already gone through and helped establish these churches, and now he's making the rounds again, just encouraging them or praising them for different things. And in this case right here, Paul is encouraging the church of Corinth about the topic of, well, you guessed it, giving. And Paul had, in his life, he understood what it meant to be a giver. And he understood what when the Bible said it is more blessed to give than to receive. He understood that part. Paul knew what it was to give. He knew what it meant. And it had a special place in his heart. And it had a special place in his heart as well, especially for the poor and the needy people. In this case would be Jerusalem. And he's encouraging this church here to raise funds to give financially for the poor and the needy there in Jerusalem. So Paul had it was a special a place in his heart was giving. I like what the commentator John Phillips said about Paul, and I thought it was interesting, and it gives us kind of a perspective on why we would get that Paul had such a heart for the poor. This is what he says. It says, Paul had a burden. That burden was for the poor saints of Jerusalem. Every time Paul went to Jerusalem, he saw widows that he had made widows, and orphans that he had made orphans. And he would hear about their desperate struggle to make ends meet. There had been born in his heart a great desire and determination to do what he could to relieve them of their special burden, at least. Of course, we know Paul's past. We know where he stood at before that conversion that took place. He was, lack of better terms, a persecutor of the Christians. And so he felt, or I guess the guilt, the overwhelming guilt of maybe he had a part in on why these widows, why these orphans, why there was so much just a poverty in Jerusalem. And that was a motivation for him to do something about it. But I believe Paul's heart wasn't just from guilt, although guilt can cause us to have a motivation about something, but I do believe he had a change of heart as well, and I believe that was just who Paul was. He was a giver. He had a love and a desire to meet the needs of those that had needs. And so that's why we see him here encouraging the church. He couldn't do it in and of himself. He had a big needy heart, but he's just one person. He needed these churches to basically join on the ropes with him and get this job done. And so he was doing everything he could to encourage these churches. Back in 1 Corinthians chapter 16, if you turn there with me, 1 Corinthians chapter 16. It's interesting to note that this church of Corinth here, again, we're still in 1 Corinthians, so that Paul is talking here to the church of Corinth. But back in chapter 16, 1 through 4, Paul had already mentioned this plan to the church. And in verse 1 it says, Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I have given order to the churches of Galatia, even so do ye. Upon the first day of the week, let every one of you lay by him in store, as God hath prospered him, that there be no gatherings when I come. And when I come, whomsoever ye shall approve by your letters, them will I send to bring your liberality unto Jerusalem. And if it be meet that I go also, they shall go with me. And we see there now concerning the collections. There's talking about the collections. Same thing here. He's talking about the collecting the offering, the money that was needed to help out the Christians in particular of Jerusalem there. And so Paul had already made this plea to the church here, and then we come back to 2 Corinthians chapter 8, and he's having to do it again. So somewhere along the lines here, whether they started off really well, they started off giving, but somewhere along the lines, things started to fizzle out. They weren't meeting their end of the bargain. They weren't keeping their promise, so to speak. And it could have been due to many different things, but most likely it was just due to a spiritual decline that was taking place amongst the church members there. And they needed a jump start. They needed to get back on board, to keep their promise. So Paul's explaining here once again, is encouraging them once again to get back on board. And Paul does so in I believe, a unique way. He doesn't just get up and say, you need to do this. I already told you once. No, now I got to tell you again. He doesn't go up there and does that, but he takes a different approach this time, and he uses an example of a group of churches, the churches at Macedonia, and how they gave, and he was encouraging the church of Corinth, I want you to model yourselves in giving the way that these churches of Macedonia did. I say churches there, that consisted of the churches of Philippi, Thessalonica, and Berea. And we learn from these churches that grace giving is the best way that Christians, you and I, can give today. And they definitely showed it. In verse 1 there, I'll read these again, but we'll start off in verse 1. It says, moreover, brethren, back in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 1. It says, moreover, brethren, we do you to wit of the grace of God bestowed on the churches of Macedonia. That funny language there, moreover, brethren, we do you to wit, basically just means we do declare, or we make known of the grace that you have. Now, the word grace here is translated just like what we would think of grace in any other way, undeserving favor, that's what it would mean. And this word grace is used countless of times in the New Testament, but Paul in his epistles alone uses over 100 times this exact same word, grace. This word reminds us really how much God has graciously given to you and I. How much God has graciously given to the church. This building here that we have, the salvation that we so richly and freely have, God's been gracious to us, hasn't He? God's been gracious to us and given us an excellent pastor, and who loves us and loves to shepherd this church, and just the many benefits and blessings that He bestows upon us each and every day. The Lord's been gracious to us. And there's not a doubt in my mind that He's been gracious to me. I hope you think the same way. If you're saved today, I pray that you are, that is enough to fill up your grace tank. You do not deserve heaven. We don't deserve one bit of grace from God, yet He has shown that to us, and the benefits just keep piling on each and every day. It's amazing the grace that we have. And so we have this grace that has been given to us, which we do not deserve, which in return reminds us, this is where the grace giving comes in, reminds us how much we owe to God for what He's done for us. And that is where the giving comes into play. We realize how much we owe to Him. We want to give our lives to Him. We'll talk about that in just a bit. But there's so many other things that we could do because God's been so good to us. We're moved to give back to Him, to give back in any way that we possibly can. God has been so good to us. Freely, we must give Him back. The Macedonian churches learned to give from the heart. They weren't doing this for their own appraisal. They were doing this from the heart because of the grace of God that was bestowed upon them. But it gets better. And look at verse 2 there of chapter 8. Yes, they gave out of, because God was so gracious to them, they gave back. But look at verse 2. It gets better. It says, how that in a great trial of affliction, the abundance of their joy and their deep poverty abounded unto the riches of their liberality. Not sure if their great trial, as it talks there, of their affliction and their poverty, if those things went hand in hand. Obviously, if you're experiencing poverty, you're most likely experiencing a great trial of affliction, or if those two were just different types of struggles that they were going with. Regardless, we really get a picture of what this church was going through, these churches. Poverty. They were poor. They didn't have much. Whatever their trial of affliction they were going through a difficult time as a church. And regardless, Paul was pleased and he was most impressed by the amount of giving that this church was able to do in spite of where they were at as far as trials and poverty. He was just impressed. He was moved. Their hardships that they were experiencing, he had to say, hey, Church of Corinth here, wake up. Look at these churches of Macedonia. Look at what they're doing. I imagine that they were exceeding giving way above the Church of Corinth, even though that they were so poor, even though they were going through such a trial. If you turn to Mark chapter 12, you kind of get a picture of what Christ likes. Mark chapter 12 and verse 41, it talks about the widow's offering of 2 mites. And the Lord mentions to his disciples of this poor widow who gave. It says in Jesus chapter 12 and verse 41, Mark chapter 12, verse 41, and Jesus sat over against the treasury and beheld how the people cast money into the treasury, and many that were rich cast in much. And there came a certain poor widow, and she threw in 2 mites, which make a farthing. And he called unto him his disciples, and saith unto them, Verily I say unto you, that this poor widow hath cast in more than all they which hath cast into the treasury. For all they did cast in of their abundance, but she of her want did cast in all that she had, even all of her living. And so we see here, once again, just on a personal level, this widow here, that she gave much. She gave more than what these rich people were able to throw into the offering plate or whatever. She gave, it wasn't just from her abundance. She had nothing. And she gave everything that she had. And what an amazing testimony that we see here and what God's really looking for. We know God. He is rich. He owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. He's not necessarily looking for us to give an extensive amount of things. He's more concerned about the heart. He's more concerned about what we can do, about us literally giving our all. Back in 2 Corinthians chapter 8 there in verse 3, it says, For to their power I bear record, yea, and beyond their power they are willing of themselves. That is to say that through their love came from, or was produced, I guess you could say, because of the grace that God had showed unto them. So then that love in return, they were able to give above and beyond what a normal person could even give, even though they were in that state that they were in. And they were willing of themselves to do so. It says they were their own power. It was almost beyond their power. That's what it says. They were just doing something that would have been a miracle in that day. And they were doing it because they were grace givers. They were giving because they wanted to give back what was so richly given to them. Giving, I understand, as I already said before, it cannot be a hot topic that preachers would talk about. Typically, they get a little awkward, I would say, in front. I mean, who wants to get up here and say, everybody needs to be giving me money in the offering plate? You know, no one wants to do that. And we all know that the offering that's collected goes towards the ministry of the church here. It goes towards the missionaries that we support out on the back. It keeps this ministry going for the cause of Christ. But regardless, money and giving is just not a topic that we like to talk about. Nobody wants to try to twist arms, to try to get people to give more. Begging of money, maybe somebody would say that it would feel that way. And really, I'm sure the pastors think that probably the best solution would be, we'll just wait till missions conference. We'll let that special speaker that comes in, he'll talk about giving, and I don't have to do it for the rest of the year. And that's probably maybe what I would do. Just let the missionaries deal with that. But when put in this perspective, though, of grace giving and the demonstration that these churches give us and how we ought to give, and not only of our finances, but of our possessions, of our talents, of our time, of our energies, all because of how much God has given to us, it kind of just makes sense, right? It really just makes sense. And if anybody could convince you of how much God has done for you, and then that would just motivate you. As Paul said, he was doing the work of the Lord because he was just compelled by how much God loved him, and he wanted to do as much as he could for the cause of Christ. And that shouldn't be any different for any Christian here today. It ought to be at the heart of every Christian of what can I give back to the Lord? How can I become better at grace giving? And with the time we have left here, I'd like to just talk about a few different points that will encourage us to be better grace givers. And these aren't anything that are, they're I guess maybe you would say common sense, but some of them are pretty neat. And I believe if we take these upon ourselves, it will help us, it will encourage us. You would think that first and foremost, as I said before, that our salvation that we have in Christ Jesus, that we do not deserve, that would be enough for us to want to give all of our power, all of our energy to the Lord. But these are some extra things just on top of that may help us to become better in these areas. And I know these are things that were a challenge to me as well. The first thing here is give your own self first. Give your own self first. We see this in verse 5, our text there in chapter 8 and verse 5. It says, "And this they did, not as we hoped, but first gave their own selves to the Lord, and unto us by the will of God." As I said before, God owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. God doesn't need us. God doesn't need our offerings. If God wants to support every missionary on that back wall without our help, he is more than able to do so. If God wants to provide the funds for us to add on to this church, he's more than willing to do so. If God wants to fill a needy position in a church, he's more than willing to do so. He's God. He's all-powerful. God doesn't need us, per se, but he wants us. He expects us. He doesn't want those things that we may have. He doesn't want our talents. He doesn't want our money. He doesn't want our time. He just wants us. He wants our hearts. He wants our energy, our whole surrendered selves to the Lord. Nothing is too big for God, but he still wants us. God chooses to use us. What a humbling fact. God chooses to use you and I to do the work that he has called us to do when he could easily do it himself. But God doesn't just want those things that you can provide. He wants your whole self. He wants your heart. He wants you first. Proverbs 23:26 says, "My son, give me thine heart." And really, that's the one gift alone that's worthy of acceptance for the Lord. If somebody were to come in with the big bucks, but they didn't give themselves to the Lord, I don't believe that God would be pleased with that offering. He first wants of ourselves. And it's really a humbling fact for me to think about that. I think we can get so caught up in service and giving and what can I do? Can I do this? Can I do that? Can I Can I fill this position here? I'm just as guilty of this. Even though I work here, sometimes I'm like, okay, what can I do here? This. That's not, I wouldn't say it's not necessarily a bad thing. We need people to step up and we need people to do things around here. But I do believe that that serving, that giving, that somebody may put their time and energy to is, as I said before, is of no true effect if you first haven't given yourself over to the Lord. If you first haven't given your heart to God and say, I want to do this for you. I don't want to do this because it makes me feel good and I get the center of attention. I want to do this for the Lord. And that mindset can be hard to adopt for a human being who is naturally built that way. But it's something that takes time. It's something that takes prayer and just constantly, daily dying to yourself and giving yourselves over to the Lord and saying, Lord, whatever you may have me to do today, you give me the opportunities to do things today, and I want to do it from a heart towards you. And that is when the Lord is pleased. These churches here, I believe they're only capable of doing what they're able to do because they first gave of themselves to the Lord. If they did not do so, I don't think they could accomplish much. And so that would be the first thing. The second thing here would be to give cheerfully. Give cheerfully. In 2 Corinthians chapter 9, just a chapter later there, in verse 7, 2 Corinthians chapter 9, in verse 7, it says, every man according as he purposeth in his heart, let him give not grudgingly or of necessity, for God loveth a cheerful giver. This verse here is separated in two different parts. First, it tells us how not to give, and then it tells us how to give. Every man according as he purposeth in his heart, so let him give not grudgingly. That word grudgingly basically means out of sorrow. It's like, oh, I got to give that money in the plate. Yeah, that's basically what it's like. I got to give my time. I got to do this service of the Lord here. It's out of sorrow. That's what it's talking about, grudgingly. It's almost like a pain to do so. Ever felt that? The pain in your back pocket, the wallet, the pocketbook, and when you got to give that money to the Lord? I'm sure we've all been there when times were tough, but that's what it's saying. It's like we're not supposed to give grudgingly or out of sorrow or out of pain. But the second part says that we need to give cheerfully. Give cheerfully. And back in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, our text there, verse 2, we skipped over, I believe, a key word. It says how that in a great trial of affliction, the abundance of their joy and their deep poverty abounded unto the riches of their liberality. Joy. Remember what grace giving is. Grace giving is giving back to the Lord because of what he has given to you. And I personally think that you will not be a cheerful giver if you don't learn to grace give. Because let's face it, it's difficult to put in of our offering or give to missions, or I'm not saying that's the case for everybody, but it's difficult sometimes to volunteer to do something at the church and have a cheerful heart about it. But if you remember what the cause of you doing this act of giving for, it's because of what God has done for you, that changes your mindset. That's automatically not out of sorrow. It's automatically not out of pain, but it's out of joy. It's a cheer, in other words. It's a happiness because of what you get to do for the Lord. And the word cheerful there, I thought it was funny. When you look at that in the Greek, it actually means hilarious in English. I use hilarious in different ways, but I mean, you get the idea, hilarious. When you do giving in the correct manner, it's hilarious. It's not really ha ha ha, but it's a sheer delight. That's what it would mean. And, here's a question, and I hope I don't step on any toes, but I'm stepping on my own toes here tonight as well. But let me ask you, have you lost the joy of your salvation? Have you lost the joy of your salvation? If you have, I want to encourage you to get excited about what you have, about the salvation that you have. Because I feel that that's maybe why it can be a chore for Christians and churches today to give. And they're not able to grace give because they've lost that first joy, the joy of their salvation and what they have. Have you lost that joy? If you realize, honestly, if you have joy of your salvation, you realize what Jesus Christ has done on the cross for you, I think if we were so serious about that, we would just be doing everything we could to give back to the Lord, just like this church here, just like these churches here in Macedonia. The third thing here is really a blessing, and it's really the icing on the cake, I guess you could say, at the end of all of that stuff, is that your giving will bless you, and it's a motivation for you to grace give, that your giving will bless you. And who doesn't like blessings? Luke 6:38, the verse says, "Give, and it shall be given unto you, good measure, pressed down and shaken together, and running over shall men give into your bosom. For with the same measure that ye mete, withal it shall be measured to you again." And this promise is still true today. That good measure that the verse is talking about may not necessarily be in return of money or material things, or maybe an extra vacation because you've given so much time in service of the Lord, but it may just be that you're just content. Maybe it's in other blessings. Maybe you won't see those blessings until you get to be in heaven with our Savior one day. And we look forward to those things. Back in 2 Corinthians 9 and verse 6, it says, "But this I say, he which soweth sparingly shall reap also sparingly, and he which soweth bountifully shall reap also bountifully." We have the sowing and the reaping principle here, and this is really along the same line as what Luke 6:38 is telling us, but it really does remind us to be careful in how we give and the motivation behind it. It's not really the how we can give, but it's not the what we give, but it's the how we give. That is the most important thing. What you put into your giving and the heart behind it will eventually determine what you reap down the road. Look at verse 8 in chapter 9 there. It says, "And God is able to make all grace abound towards you, that ye always having all sufficiency in all things may abound to every good work." Again, we receive the blessings from God. This does not mean that God makes every person wealthy who gives. It's not the case at all. But it does mean that the Christian who practices grace giving will always have what he needs. Will always be content. Sufficiency there, that's what that word means. It's the same word as content. Just 1 Timothy 6:6, it says, "Godliness with contentment is great gain." That's the same word there. And you won't have any need to worry. You won't have any need to fret because you're concerned. You're afraid because of your giving. No, the Lord will provide for you. You will be content. You will be suffice to say. So let's not forget that we cannot outgive God in these areas. Oftentimes we think it's about the amount. Oftentimes we think about it's what can I do, or hustling around and such. But remember the heart. Remember the heart behind these things. That outweighs what you can give any other day. That is what grace giving is. I always love what somebody says. It says, "I shovel out, he shovels in," talking about God, but he definitely has a bigger shovel. And that's so true. And I want to end with this. It's a little illustration here by Murray Harris. It says, All too often, we regard stewardship simply as a matter of our giving to God. But this aspect is secondary. Before we can give, we must possess. And before we possess, we must receive. Therefore, stewardship is, in the first place, receiving God's goods and bounteous gifts. And once received, those gifts are not to be used solely for our own good. They must also be used for the benefit of others, and ultimately for the glory of God, the giver. The steward needs an open hand to receive from God, and then an active hand to give to God and to others. All that we have is from the hands of God. You ever thought about that? And we do not gain anything in and of ourselves. And so what a great perspective there. What has been given to us from God, that should encourage us, challenge us to give back to him and then to others in return. So much has God given to us. His grace and mercy overflows abundantly each and every day. We have been freely given, and we have been freely invested in, each and every one of us spiritually here at this church and maybe at home by our parents. And it would be foolish of us to not in return be grace givers, to give back what has been given to us.